Under the scorching sun at the waterfall, an arrogant businessman pushes his elderly blind father to the edge of the slippery rocks. "Jump for my friends, old man. Show them how brave your ancestors were." Cruel laughter echoes as cell phone cameras record everything. The elderly man, with trembling hands resting on his staff, hesitates. His wrinkled face shows dignity, not fear. What no one notices is the ancestral connection between the old man and the sacred waters. When he finally moves, the arrogant man's fate will be sealed forever. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, to follow stories that touch the heart and transform lives, do it right now, because this narrative will change the way you see the world. The thin mountain air carried the echo of cruel laughter as Thomas adjusted the staff in his calloused hands, his vision blurred by advanced cataracts, barely distinguishing the arrogant figures before him. Henry Sterling, heir to a hotel empire, built along the sacred waters of the Vale Falls, pointed dismissively at the slippery rocks bordering the 100-foot precipice. "Come on, old man!" Henry's voice cut through the air like a razor, amplified by the laughter of the businessmen and influencers surrounding him, all with cell phones in hand, ready to record the spectacle. "My guests paid good money to see local traditions. Show us how your ancestors jumped from stone to stone. The warrior ritual, isn't that what you call it?" Thomas felt his heart tighten. At 72, with his vision deteriorated by cataracts that had progressed for 5 years, he could barely distinguish where the earth ended and the deadly void began. His daughter Sarah rushed to his side, her face contorted in indignation. "Mr. Sterling, my father isn't a circus attraction." Sarah positioned herself protectively in front of Thomas, her brown eyes flashing with anger. "He is the guardian of this mountain's traditions, not a clown for your entertainment." The young businessman, with his 32 years of arrogance, cultivated in a golden cradle, approached with a condescending smile. The expensive perfume emanating from his designer clothes contrasted brutally with the scent of earth and medicinal herbs that always accompanied Thomas. "Guardian of traditions?" Henry let out a dry laugh. "What traditions? This place was dying until I built my resort. You lived in poverty, cultivating your little herbs and telling legends to lost tourists. I brought progress, jobs, money." Thomas raised his head with dignity, his misty eyes fixing on the spot where he imagined the young man's face to be. "You built concrete walls on sacred land, son. You turned our ancestors' sanctuary into chlorinated swimming pools. So what?" Henry gestured impatiently. "The old ways are over, Grandpa. Now it's business, it's development, and you," he paused dramatically, "you depend on me. Half this village works at my resort. The other half lives off what my guests spend." Sarah clenched her fists, but Thomas gently touched her arm, a gesture he had practiced so much that his partial blindness didn't prevent it. "Dad, let's go," she whispered, her voice trembling with contained rage. "It's not worth it." But Henry wasn't finished. He signaled to one of his assistants, who quickly approached with a tablet. "Do you know what this is, Sarah?" The businessman turned the screen towards her. "It's the petition to close the community center. That old, musty place where you give your little tradition classes to the kids. One click from me, and it becomes a resort parking lot." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant roar of the waterfall. Sarah paled, her eyes quickly scanning the digital document. The community center was more than a building. It was where the children learned the language of the elders, where the seniors gathered to share stories, where she herself taught the new generations about medicinal plants. "You can't," she began, but Henry interrupted her. "I can and I will, unless—" He turned back to Thomas with a predatory smile. "The old man here does his little demonstration. Nothing much, just jumping from stone to stone like the warriors of old. My guests love these folk things." Thomas closed his eyes, not from blindness but from the pain of seeing his culture reduced to cheap entertainment. The stones Henry pointed to were treacherous, even for someone with perfect vision. Wet from the constant spray of the waterfall, covered in moss, they had already caused fatal accidents in the past. "Henry, please," a female voice emerged from the group of guests. It was Isabella, the wife of one of the businessmen, her blue eyes showing discomfort. "This is dangerous. The man is blind." "Partially blind," Henry corrected dismissively. And they say he knows every stone on this mountain. Well, if he's really the guardian he claims to be. The sudden wind that swept the viewpoint brought with it the unmistakable aroma of wild lilac, the sacred bush that bloomed only in moments of great spiritual importance. Thomas recognized the sign, just as his grandmother had taught him decades ago. "I accept your challenge," the words came out before Sarah could protest, "but on one condition." Henry raised his eyebrows, surprised by the acceptance. "What is it?" "If I complete the course, you will not only preserve the community center, but you will invest in its renovation and expansion." "Dad, no!" Sarah grabbed his arm. "It's crazy! You can barely see!" Thomas turned to her, and even through the mist covering his vision, Sarah could see the ancestral determination that defined his lineage. "Daughter, there are things more important than the safety of the body. The soul of our people is at stake." Henry quickly consulted his guests, who murmured excitedly at the prospect of the spectacle. Cameras were positioned. Bets whispered among nervous laughter. "Deal." Henry extended his hand, but Thomas couldn't see it. The businessman's momentary embarrassment generated more laughter among his friends. "Oh, I forgot. You can't see well." Sarah watched the preparations with a heavy heart. She knew those stones as well as her father. She had played on them as a child, before the dams upstream made the current more violent and unpredictable. Now, with the resort consuming massive amounts of water, the waterfall's flow varied drastically throughout the day. "I need a few minutes to prepare," Thomas announced, moving away from the group. He walked carefully to a large flat stone that served as a natural altar, where generations of healers had performed healing rituals. Sarah followed him, as did some curious onlookers, including old Mrs. Gable, owner of the small family inn that competed pathetically with Henry's mega resort. "Thomas, this is suicide," Mrs. Gable whispered, her elderly hands trembling. "Even when you were young and had perfect vision, this course was dangerous." The healer knelt before the altar stone, his hands fumbling until they found a small leather pouch he always carried. From within, he took out a handful of dried herbs, a mixture his grandmother called heart's vision. "True vision doesn't come from the eyes, Clara," he murmured, scattering the herbs in a precise pattern. "It comes from the connection with the earth, with the ancestors, with the creator of all things." Sarah bit her lip, recognizing the ritual. It was the same preparation her father performed before harvesting the rarest medicinal plants, those that grew in inaccessible locations. But it was one thing to climb a steep slope, another entirely different to jump over wet stones on the edge of a deadly precipice. "Mom, talk to him," Sarah pleaded to the sky, remembering the strong woman who had passed away 5 years earlier. Almost at the same time, blindness had begun to steal Thomas's sight. Rose had been the family's anchor, the voice of reason that balanced her husband's mysticism with loving pragmatism. The aroma of burning herbs spiraled upward, mixing with the mist of the waterfall. Thomas murmured words in the old language, sounds that few besides him still knew. It was a prayer for protection, but also for acceptance. Acceptance that the Guardian's path sometimes required unthinkable sacrifices. "It's taking too long!" Henry's impatient voice cut through the sacred moment. "Let's get this over with." Thomas rose slowly, the staff held firmly in his right hand. Sarah noticed that the wrinkles on his face seemed deeper, but there was something different in his posture, an energy she hadn't seen in years. "I'm ready," he announced, turning towards the group. The course consisted of 7 stones arranged in an irregular sequence along the edge of the waterfall. The first was only 6 feet from the bank, but each subsequent jump increased in distance and difficulty. The last stone, known as Warrior's Tear for its peculiar shape, was dangerously close to the point where the water plunged 100 feet below. Henry positioned himself strategically, where he would have the best view, his state-of-the-art cell phone capturing every moment in high definition. His guests formed a semicircle, some genuinely concerned, others morbidly fascinated. Thomas approached the first stone. Sarah ran to intercept him, but he raised his hand in a gesture she had known since childhood, the sign that the decision was made. "If anything happens to me," he said softly, just for her to hear, "you know where the manuscripts are." The knowledge cannot die with us. Dad, tears streamed freely down Sarah's face. Have faith, my daughter. Sometimes the Lord asks us to walk on water. With those words, Thomas took the first step. His staff touched the surface of the first stone, testing its stability. The old wood, polished by decades of use, found firm support. He shifted his weight, his right foot finding the slippery surface. A murmur went through the group as he successfully completed the first jump. Henry frowned. He expected the old man to stumble right at the start, providing easy laughs for his guests. The second stone was nearly 3 feet away. Thomas tilted his head, not to see but to hear. The roar of the waterfall had nuances that only trained ears perceived, variations that indicated the strength of the current, the direction of the wind, the amount of spray in the air. He jumped. For a terrible moment it seemed he would lose his balance. His body swayed dangerously, the staff spinning in the air as his arms sought stability. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, stifling a scream. But Thomas regained his balance. More than that, there was grace in his movements, a fluidity that defied his age and condition. It was as if something beyond himself guided his steps. Incredible, Isabella whispered, genuinely impressed. He really can't see. The third stone presented an additional challenge. It was smaller than the previous ones and perpetually wet from the more intense spray in that section. Thomas paused, his face turned towards the sky. Those close enough could see his lips moving in silent prayer. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. A blue morpho butterfly, a rare species at those altitudes, landed gently on Thomas's shoulder. Sarah gasped. It was the same type of butterfly that had appeared at her mother's funeral, considered by the ancients as a messenger between worlds. "Grandma Rose," Thomas murmured, a smile touching his lips for the first time since the challenge began. With renewed confidence, he executed the third jump. His feet found the wet stone, but instead of slipping, he seemed to dance on it, the staff twirling in a movement that resembled the ancient warrior dances of his tribe. Henry clenched, his fists annoyed. The spectacle was taking an unexpected turn. Instead of humiliation, it was becoming something inspiring. His guests, previously laughing, now watched in respectful silence. "How does he do that?" asked Robert, one of the businessmen, genuinely perplexed. "It's like he can see." The fourth stone was the most treacherous so far. Known as Jaguar's Tooth for its irregular, pointed surface, it had caused falls even among the most experienced. Thomas hesitated, but not out of fear. He was hearing something others couldn't perceive. The wind had changed direction, bringing with it not only the scent of wild lilac, but also of lemon balm and rosemary, Rose's favorite plants, which she cultivated in the small garden behind the house. Sarah also smelled the perfume, and her eyes widened with understanding. "Mom is here," she whispered to Mrs. Gable, who squeezed her hand in silent support. Thomas jumped. In the air for a fraction of a second, he seemed to float, a physical impossibility that several cell phones recorded, but which later no one could rationally explain. He landed on the irregular stone with the lightness of a feather, his staff finding support in a crevice his eyes couldn't see, but which his instincts knew perfectly. The audience erupted in murmurs of admiration. Even some of Henry's more cynical friends began to applaud spontaneously. The businessman, furious, made a sharp gesture for them to be quiet. "There are still 3 stones left," he growled. "The worst ones." It was true, the final 3 stones posed an exponentially greater challenge. The fifth, called Spirit's Table, was flat but constantly covered by a thin layer of running water. The sixth, Leap of Faith, required a jump of nearly 6 feet. And the seventh stone was legendary. Warrior's Tear was so close to the waterfall that the roar was deafening, and the spray created a perpetual mist. They said only 3 people in the tribe's entire history had managed to reach it, and all were young warriors at the peak of their strength and vision. Thomas took a deep breath. The butterfly still rested on his shoulder, its wings occasionally beating as if marking a rhythm only he could feel. "Mr. Thomas," an unexpected voice called him. It was Mark, one of the cameramen hired by Henry. "Please, you don't have to continue. You've made your point. Shut up." Henry roughly pushed the employee. "He made a deal. He goes all the way or he loses everything. Thomas ignored the argument. His attention was focused on the sound of the water, the feel of the wind on his skin, the comforting weight of the staff in his hand. More importantly, he was focused on the presence he felt around him, not only of Rose, but of all his ancestors who had guarded those sacred lands. The jump to the fifth stone was executed with a precision that defied any logical explanation. Thomas not only landed safely on the slippery surface, he slid over it as if skating, using the momentum to position himself perfectly for the next challenge. Sarah fell to her knees, her hands clasped in prayer. Around her, other villagers had joined the group, attracted by the commotion. Old man Samuel, the retired carpenter, Mrs. Evans, the midwife, John Miller, the blacksmith. Everyone had known Thomas forever. Everyone had been touched by his wisdom and healing at some point. "It's a miracle," Mrs. Evans whispered, making the sign of the cross. The sixth stone required something more than skill. It required absolute faith. The distance of 6 feet might not seem like much for a young athlete, but for a 72-year-old man partially blind, it was an insurmountable chasm, Thomas calculated. Not with his eyes, but with every fiber of his being that had memorized that place over decades. He backed up a few steps on the stone he was on, which caused exclamations of concern from the audience. "He's going to get a running start," Robert realized, impressed. But if he miscalculates, Thomas ran. 3 quick steps on the slippery stone, the staff raised like a spear, his body leaning forward in perfect balance. At the last instant, he planted the staff and propelled himself. The jump was magnificent. For long seconds, Thomas flew over the abyss, the waterfall roaring below, the spray creating a momentary rainbow around him. The butterfly left his shoulder, accompanying him in the air like a celestial escort. He landed on the 6th stone with an impact that reverberated through the rock. For a moment he stumbled and everyone held their breath. Then, miraculously, he regained his balance once more. The crowd erupted in cheers. Even some of Henry's guests applauded openly, ignoring their host's furious stares. The businessman was livid. His plan for humiliation had turned into an epic triumph for the old healer. But the last stone remained. The warrior's tear waited, shrouded in perpetual mist, the roar of the waterfall so loud at that point that it was impossible to hear anything else. Thomas turned slowly, facing the final challenge. The stone was only 5 feet away, but the problem wasn't the distance. It was the near-zero visibility and the certainty that one mistake would mean a deadly fall. It was then that Sarah noticed something extraordinary. The clouds that had covered the sun all morning began to part. A ray of golden light pierced the mist, illuminating the warrior's tear precisely like a divine spotlight. "Look!" Someone in the crowd shouted, "The light!" Thomas felt the warmth of the sun on his face. For a brief instant, the mist seemed less dense, as if an invisible hand was pushing it away. He closed his eyes completely. Ironically, it was only when he completely abandoned the attempt to see that his inner vision became crystal clear. In his mind, each stone appeared with perfect clarity, not as he saw them now through misty eyes, but as he had known them in his youth, every texture, every crevice, every secret. And there, shining like a jewel, was the warrior's tear. "Thank you, my God," he murmured. "Thank you for showing me the way." With absolute calm, Thomas executed the final jump. It wasn't spectacular like the previous one. It was simple, precise, perfect. He landed on the warrior's tear as if returning home after a long journey. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the waterfall seemed to lessen its roar for an instant. Then, like a breaking dam, emotion exploded. Sarah ran along the bank, tears of joy streaming down her face. The villagers shouted and hugged each other. Even Isabella openly wept, touched by the display of courage and faith. Only Henry remained motionless, his face a mask of contained fury. His plans had been not only frustrated, but completely reversed. Instead of humiliating the old healer, he had inadvertently created a legend. "He did it," Mark, the cameraman, whispered in awe. "He actually did it." Thomas remained on the warrior's tear for long moments, his face turned towards the sky, his body bathed in the waterfall's spray. The butterfly returned, landing again on his shoulder like a sapphire blue blessing. Thomas's return was even more impressive than his outward journey. Guided by a serenity that transcended any explanation, he retraced the path with measured, sure steps. When he finally reached the bank, Sarah wrapped him in a desperate hug, her body trembling with the release of accumulated tension. "Dad, I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence, her emotions overflowing in sobs. Thomas stroked his daughter's hair, his misty eyes shining with his own tears. "I had help, my daughter. Your mother was with me every step of the way." Henry approached, his face contorted between anger and disbelief. The tablet in his hands visibly trembled as he stared at the deal he had just lost. That was a trick," he stammered, desperately searching for an explanation. "You rehearsed. Someone helped you." "Mr. Sterling," Thomas replied with unshakable dignity, "you have the recordings. Your own eyes were witnesses. Keep your word." A murmur went through Henry's guests. Robert stepped forward, his face showing a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "Henry, the man is right. We all saw it. It was extraordinary." "Shut up!" Henry turned furiously to his friend. "Don't you understand? This old man made a fool of me." "No," a female voice intervened. "It was Isabella," still wiping away tears. "You did that all by yourself. This man simply defended his community with courage and dignity." Henry spun on his heels, facing the woman. "You too? All of you, seduced by the tricks of an old charlatan." "Charlatan?" Mrs. Gable, who until then had remained silent, stepped forward. Her 78 years didn't diminish the strength in her voice. "Thomas saved my daughter when the doctors gave up, saved half this village with his knowledge of herbs when the epidemic hit 10 years ago. If that's charlatanism, then blessed be." More voices rose from the growing crowd. John Miller recounted how Thomas had healed his debilitating arthritis. Samuel remembered the time the healer had saved his grandson from a venomous snakebite. Mrs. Evans spoke of the difficult births Thomas had assisted with his remedies when the health post was without resources. Henry recoiled with each testimony, his face losing color. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the challenge to turn into a public judgment of his own values. "All right," he finally shouted, throwing up his hands. "You win. The community center will be renovated. Satisfied?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "It's not about winning or losing, son. It's about understanding that development without respect for roots is just destruction in disguise." "Don't call me son," Henry spat the words. "And don't give me lectures. I built an empire here. I brought prosperity." "Prosperity for whom?" Sarah had regained her composure, her voice as firm as the rock beneath her feet. "For the workers you lay off every season? For the families evicted to make way for your parking lot? For the river that's dying because of the water diversion for your pools?" Henry opened his mouth to retort, but was interrupted by a sudden noise. His state-of-the-art cell phone slipped from his trembling hands, falling directly into a puddle. The screen flickered once before going permanently dark. "Damn it!" He bent down to pick up the useless device, and it was then that something strange happened. Upon touching the water, Henry felt an electric current run through his body. Not physical, but something deeper. For a brief instant, it was as if he could feel the mountain itself, its ancient age, its pain from the cuts and perforations of unchecked development, its infinite patience. He recoiled abruptly, the dead cell phone forgotten on the ground. His eyes met Thomas's, and for the first time, there was something beyond arrogance in them. There was fear. What was that? Thomas approached slowly, his staff gently tapping the stones. "The mountain spoke to you, son. It does that when it considers someone worthy of a second chance." "I don't—" Henry ran a hand through his hair, completely bewildered. "This is crazy. Mountains don't talk, don't they?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Then how do you explain what you just felt? How do you explain what you just witnessed?" The crowd watched in tense silence. Something was changing. They could feel it. Something fundamental in the balance of power that governed their lives. Mark, the cameraman, approached hesitantly. "Mr. Sterling, I recorded everything. Mr. Thomas's jump, but also the moment you touched the water. Your expression, it was like you saw your own soul." "Delete that." Henry ordered automatically, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "I can't do that," Mark replied, surprising himself with his own courage. This is history, it's truth, people need to see it." Other employees of Henry began to speak up. Waiters, maids, security guards, people who worked at the resort but lived in the village, divided between two worlds. One by one, they began to share their own stories about Thomas and about the abuses they suffered at the resort. "He makes us work overtime without pay," said a maid. "Fires anyone who gets sick," added a waiter. "Pollutes the river and blames the residents," a gardener concluded. Henry's head spun frantically, watching his carefully constructed world crumble. "You're my employees, I pay your salaries." "What do you pay with?" Thomas intervened softly. "With money earned from the exploitation of sacred land? With profits extracted from the sweat of humble people?" It was then that something else extraordinary happened. The blue butterfly, which had remained perched on Thomas's shoulder, took flight. It circled once over the crowd, then landed gently on Henry's outstretched hand. The businessman froze, staring at the delicate creature. Its wings beat slowly, reflecting the sunlight in impossible shades of blue. For a moment, Henry saw himself, reflected in those wings, not as he was, but as he could be. "Rose always said," Thomas explained softly, "that butterflies are souls in transformation. They show us that change is possible, that beauty can emerge from the darkness of the chrysalis." Henry swallowed hard, still mesmerized by the butterfly. "Your wife, she died 5 years ago, didn't she?" Thomas nodded. "The same day my sight began to fail. But I discovered that sometimes we need to lose one kind of vision to gain another." The butterfly took flight again, disappearing into the waterfall's mist. Henry remained with his hand extended, as if he could still feel the delicate touch on his palm. He began, then stopped, struggling with words he had never needed to use before. "I'm sorry." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah squeezed her father's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles relax slightly. "Being sorry is a start," Thomas replied, "but true change requires action." Henry looked around, at his embarrassed guests, at the hopeful employees, at the united villagers. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly small. "What do you suggest?" The words came out almost inaudible. Thomas tapped his staff on the ground 3 times, a ritual gesture that everyone in the village recognized. It was the call to council, the ancestral summons for important community decisions. "I suggest we talk," he said simply. "Not as boss and employees, not as exploiter and exploited, but as human beings sharing the same land, drinking the same water, breathing the same air." The council was scheduled for late afternoon at the community center Henry had threatened to demolish. The old building, with its adobe walls and clay tile roof, seemed small and humble compared to the gleaming resort, but there was a dignity in it that no modern building could replicate. Thomas asked Sarah to fetch something from the old chest they kept in the attic. She returned with a bundle of thick cloth, which her father unrolled to reveal a worn leather-bound notebook. "What is this?" Henry asked, genuinely curious. "The record of our history," Thomas replied, his hands caressing the cover with reverence. "Every healer in my lineage contributed their discoveries, medicinal plants, healing rituals, observations about the seasons and the waters. 3 centuries of knowledge." Robert approached, fascinated. "Can I see?" Thomas opened the notebook carefully. The yellowed pages were covered with notes in different handwritings, detailed drawings of plants, maps of the mountain's secret trails. Some sections were in the old language, others in archaic Portuguese. "This is a treasure," Isabella whispered, amazed. "It should be in a museum." "Museums keep dead things," Thomas corrected gently. "This knowledge is alive because it is still used." "Sarah, show them." Sarah took the notebook and leafed through to a specific page. "This is the recipe that saved Mrs. Gable. A combination of herbs that doesn't exist in any modern medical manual, but which our ancestors developed by observing the animals of the forest." Mrs. Gable nodded emotionally. "The doctors said it was impossible, but here I am." Henry watched everything with a strange expression. It was as if layers of certainty were being peeled away, revealing something he had buried deeply. "My grandmother," he said suddenly, surprising everyone. "She had a similar notebook. Old recipes, stories. My father said it was superstition, told them to burn everything when she died." Thomas tilted his head with compassion. How many stories have we lost like that? How much wisdom discarded in the name of progress? The community center filled up as the sun went down. Residents of all ages arrived, some bringing chairs from home, others simply sitting on the floor. Henry had never seen so many faces together. He had always dealt with numbers, statistics, not with real people. "Let's begin," Thomas announced, when the last ray of sun touched the mountains. What followed was not a usual meeting. Thomas asked each person present to share a memory, something the mountain meant to them. One by one, the residents spoke. Samuel talked about his first job, cutting wood sustainably as his father had taught him. Mrs. Evans recalled the births performed with the help of traditional midwives before the first doctor arrived in the region. John Miller spoke about the iron respectfully extracted from the mountain, used to create tools that lasted generations. Each story was a thread in the complex tapestry of community life. Henry listened, initially impatient, then interested, finally absorbed. He began to see what he had destroyed without realizing it, not just trees and stones, but memories, traditions, invisible bonds that held those people together. "And you, Mr. Sterling?" Thomas asked eventually. "What is your memory of the mountain?" Henry swallowed hard. For a long moment he was silent. Then, in a hoarse voice, "I first came here when I was 8. My father was looking for land to invest in. I got lost during a walk, ended up near the waterfall. I was terrified. Crying—" He stopped, struggling with the memory. "Continue," Thomas encouraged gently. "An old woman found me, old with braided white hair. She gave me water from a gourd, showed me the way back. I never knew her name, but—" Henry looked around. "She looked like many of the ladies here." "That was probably my great-aunt Eleanor," Mrs. Gable suggested. "She was always walking those trails, collecting herbs. She told me something," Henry continued, his voice almost inaudible. "She said the mountain had chosen me for something important, but that I would need to choose between building or destroying." The silence that followed was profound. Thomas closed his eyes, murmuring something in the old language. "The words of the ancestors are never in vain," he said finally. "You were chosen, Henry. The question is, what will you choose to do with that calling?" It was Sarah who broke the silence. "Dad, tell them about Mom's dream," Thomas smiled sadly. "Rose always dreamed of creating a place where ancient and new knowledge could meet. A healing center that honored our traditions but also embraced modern medicine. She said we didn't have to choose between the past and the future. We could have both." "A hospital?" Robert suggested. "More than that," Thomas explained. "A research and healing center, where our traditional remedies could be scientifically studied, where doctors could learn from healers and vice versa, where tourism would bring resources without destroying the essence of the place." Henry stood up abruptly, walking to the window. From the community center, he could see the lit-up resort in the distance, its artificial lights competing with the first stars. "How much would it cost?" he asked without turning around. "It's not a matter of cost," Thomas replied. "It's a matter of will, of understanding that true profit isn't just measured in money." "I could—" Henry began, then stopped. "My resort could be part of this. Guests could learn about local culture, participate in healing retreats, support the research." "Now you're beginning to see," Thomas said, a smile touching his lips. The following hours were of intense planning. Ideas flowed, barriers fell. Robert, it turned out, had experience in sustainable projects. Isabella knew investors interested in alternative medicine. Mark suggested documentaries that could attract positive global attention. But it was the moment Henry took off his expensive jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and sat on the floor with the others that marked the real change. There, on that dirt floor, the arrogant heir began his transformation into something greater. "We need clean water," he said, surprising himself. "I'll reverse the river diversion and the unfair layoffs. Everyone who wants to can come back with a raise." The murmurs of approval were interrupted by an unexpected sound: rain. After weeks of drought, the first drops began to fall, gentle but steady. "The mountain is responding," Thomas observed, lifting his face to feel the water. "It recognizes the change in hearts." Henry left the community center, letting the rain wash his face. For the first time in years, he felt clean, not just physically, but somewhere deeper. "Thomas," he called, turning back to the healer, "I need to learn not just about herbs and traditions, but about how to truly see." Thomas approached slowly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "True vision begins when we acknowledge our blindness. You took the first step today." The meeting continued into the night, but something fundamental had changed. The initial confrontation had transformed into collaboration, arrogance into humility, fear into hope. 3 months passed since that transformative night. The mountain, previously divided between old and new, began to find its balance. The community center had become a construction site, but not the kind Henry had originally planned. Instead of demolition, it was rebirth. Sarah supervised the digital cataloging of ancestral knowledge, photographing every page of the precious notebook, while Thomas dictated detailed explanations about each plant, each ritual, each observation accumulated over centuries. "This one here," Thomas pointed to an elaborate drawing of a blue flower, "only blooms on full moon nights near the equinox. Its nectar, mixed with wild honey and rue leaves, helps clear the mind in moments of great decision." Across the room, Henry listened attentively while taking notes. His hands, previously soft and well-kept, now showed calluses from the physical work he insisted on sharing with the laborers. "How do you know the exact time to harvest?" he asked, genuinely fascinated. "You feel it," Thomas answered simply. "The plant tells you when it's ready, but to listen, you first need to learn to be silent." It was a lesson Henry was learning painfully. Used to giving orders and making quick decisions, he now needed to practice patience, observation, humility. It wasn't easy. Frequently, his old nature tried to resurface. "Mr. Sterling," John Miller called from the entrance, "the engineer is here to discuss the rainwater harvesting system." Henry got up but paused, noticing Thomas's meaningful look. "What do you think, John?" he asked, surprising the blacksmith. "You've known these lands longer. Where would be the best place to position the collectors?" The older man's face lit up. It was the first time someone from the Sterling family had asked his opinion on something important. As the men went out to examine the terrain, Sarah approached her father. "He's really changing, isn't he?" Thomas ran a hand through his daughter's hair, an affectionate gesture he had practiced since she was small. The seed was always there. Sometimes we just need the right storm for it to germinate. Outside, the transformation was even more visible. Where there had once been concrete parking lots, medicinal herb gardens now grew. The old helipad had been converted into a greenhouse for rare plants, and most symbolically, the fence separating. The resort from the village was being removed, piece by piece. Robert coordinated the construction of the new research center, a structure that blended traditional building techniques with modern sustainable technology. Bioconstruction with high tech, he explained enthusiastically to anyone who would listen. The best of both worlds. Isabella had established an exchange program, bringing researchers from prestigious universities to study with Thomas and the other local healers. She herself spent hours learning about the properties of plants, often surprising herself with the depth of traditional knowledge. "It's incredible," she commented one day, examining an ointment Mrs. Gable had prepared. "The combination of these herbs has anti-inflammatory properties that rival pharmaceutical drugs but without the side effects." But not all changes came without resistance. Some of Henry's investors didn't understand his new direction. There were tense meetings, threats of capital withdrawal, pressure to return to the previous model of exploitation. It was during one of these crises that Henry faced his greatest test. A group of investors arrived unexpectedly, led by Davidson, a hotel magnate known for his ruthlessness. "Henry, what the hell is going on here?" Davidson demanded, observing with disdain the herb gardens where a VIP parking lot had once been. "I received reports of falling profits, unauthorized employee raises, cancelled expansion projects. The old Henry would have panicked, would have caved in. But the man who now stood before Davidson had changed. In his hands, instead of financial reports, he carried a small pot with a wild lilac sapling. "Profits are transforming, not decreasing," Henry replied calmly. "We're building something sustainable here." "Sustainable?" Davidson spat the word as if it were poison. "I invested in a luxury resort, not a hippie ashram." It was then that Thomas appeared, as he always did in crucial moments. He walked, slowly, his staff tapping rhythmically on the ground, until he stopped before Davidson. "Do you know the story of the wild lilac?" Thomas asked gently, gesturing to the sapling in Henry's hands. Davidson frowned, annoyed by the interruption. "I didn't come here for botany lessons, old man." "Indulge me," Thomas insisted with a smile. "The wild lilac spends most of the year without leaves, appearing dead. Many cut the bush during this period, thinking it's useless wood. But those who are patient..." At that moment, as if answering a call, the small sapling in Henry's pot began to sprout a single purple flower, delicate but vibrant. "Are rewarded with the mountain's most spectacular bloom," Thomas finished. Sarah, who had quietly approached, added, "The wood of the early cut lilac rots quickly, but the bush that blooms naturally provides wood that lasts for centuries." Davidson looked from the flower to Thomas to Henry, clearly struggling between greed and something deeper that was beginning to awaken. "How long?" he finally asked. "For the first full bloom?" Thomas considered. "With the right care, 2 years. To reach full maturity, a decade. But each year brings its own beauty, its own return." Henry stepped forward. "I can show you the projected numbers, Davidson. Conscious tourism, certified medicinal products, pharmaceutical research, environmental education. The long-term returns far exceed the previous model. And what's more," Robert intervened, "we're attracting a different kind of investor. People interested in legacy, not just quick profit." The tension in the air was palpable. Davidson looked around, at the hopeful faces of the residents, at the visible transformation of the space, at the small purple flower that defied all logic by blooming out of season. "You have 6 months, he finally said. 6 months to prove. To me, this isn't complete madness." After the investors left, Henry collapsed onto a bench, suddenly exhausted. The pressure of balancing 2 worlds was taking its toll. "Questioning your decision?" Thomas sat beside him. "Every day," Henry admitted. "But then I remember..." He stopped, searching for words. "Remember what?" "My face reflected in the wings of that butterfly. What could have been if I continued on the old path, and what I can still become." Thomas nodded wisely. "True transformation is never easy. The caterpillar must completely dissolve before emerging as a butterfly." That night, something extraordinary happened. Henry had gone up to the waterfall alone, something he did frequently now when he needed to think. The full moon illuminated the waters, creating a silver path on the surface. It was then that he saw it. The blue flower Thomas had mentioned, the one that only bloomed on full moon nights near the equinox. It was growing in a crevice in the rock, exactly where 3 months earlier he had forced Thomas to perform his deadly challenge. Henry knelt before the flower, marveling at its ethereal beauty. Translucent blue petals seemed to glow with their own light, and a soft but intoxicating perfume filled the air. "You found it." He turned to see Sarah approaching, carrying a small gourd. "Thomas said you would be here, asked me to bring this." She handed the gourd to Henry. "To collect the nectar, but it has to be done with pure intention." Henry looked from the flower to Sarah, unsure. "I don't know how..." "Close your eyes," she instructed gently. "Breathe. Empty your mind of numbers and plans. Just be." Henry followed Sarah's instructions, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. The aroma of the blue flower intensified, enveloping him in a perfumed mist that seemed to penetrate not just his lungs, but his very essence. "Now," Sarah whispered, "bring the gourd close to the flower, but without touching it. Let the nectar choose to come to you." With trembling hands, Henry positioned the small container beneath the luminous petals. For long moments, nothing happened. Then, like tears of liquid light, drops of the precious nectar began to drip into the gourd. It's magical," he murmured, amazed. It's natural, Sarah corrected gently. The magic is in finally being able to see. When the last drop fell, the flower closed its petals as if it knew it had fulfilled its purpose. Henry held the gourd as if it were the most precious treasure in the world, and perhaps it was. On the way back to the community center, Sarah shared stories about her mother. Rose always said that every person has a blue flower waiting to bloom inside them. We just need to find the right moon, the moment of transformation. They found Thomas in the makeshift laboratory, where Isabella and a young university researcher were cataloging plant samples. The old healer smiled upon, seeing the nectar in the gourd. The mountain has accepted you completely now, he said to Henry. This nectar. It is given only to those the mountain recognizes as true guardians. In the days that followed, Henry's transformation accelerated. The nectar, mixed with honey and herbs according to the old recipe, seemed to have unlocked something within him. Not mystical powers, but a clarity of purpose he had never experienced. The center's projects flourished. The first class of students, doctors, pharmacists, botanists, arrived for the immersion program. They came skeptical and left amazed, carrying not only knowledge, but a new respect for traditional wisdom. Dr. Chen, a renowned pharmacologist from Los Angeles, summarized it perfectly. I spent 20 years synthesizing compounds in a lab, only to discover that many already existed perfectly balanced in nature. Thomas and his team aren't just healers. They are scientists who use the mountain as their laboratory. The most significant moment came when Thomas announced that Sarah was ready to take on certain responsibilities as a healer. The ceremony was simple but profound, held in the sacred clearing where generations of healers had passed on their knowledge. The true healer, Thomas said, placing his hands on his daughter's shoulders, is not just one who knows the plants, but one who understands hearts. Sarah, you have proven to have both gifts. Henry watched, moved, realizing he was witnessing something precious, the living preservation of a tradition, adapting without losing its essence. But the real test came 6 months later, when Davidson returned with other investors. Henry received them not in the resort's luxurious conference room, but in the medicinal herb garden, where village children were learning to identify plants under Mrs. Gable's supervision. Is this a kindergarten now? Davidson asked sarcastically. It's a school, Robert explained, approaching with a tablet full of data. These children are learning applied botany, basic chemistry, practical ecology. By the age of 10, they know more about medicinal plants than many college students. Isabella joined the group, bringing samples of products developed at the center. 3 patents already registered, 2 in process, partnerships with international laboratories, and this, she showed a small bottle of ointment, has just received approval for clinical trials. It could revolutionize burn treatment. Davidson examined the numbers Robert presented. His eyes widened slightly. The profits weren't just sustainable, they were growing exponentially. But the true return, Henry said, watching the children laugh as Mrs. Gable told stories about each plant, cannot be measured only in money. Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills, Davidson retorted, but his voice lacked its previous hardness. It was then that Mark approached, carrying a laptop. Mr. Davidson, can I show you something? On the screen, he displayed the documentary he had produced about the resort's transformation. The video had gone viral, attracting millions of views and generating a wave of conscious tourism that far surpassed the numbers of the previous model. People from all over the world want to come here, Mark explained. Not just to relax, but to learn, to heal, to transform. We've created something unique. Davidson watched in silence, his face an indecipherable mask. When the video ended, he remained quiet for long moments. "Show me the waterfall," he finally said. The group walked up the familiar trail, now marked with educational signs about the local flora. Upon reaching the viewpoint, the setting sun painted the waters in golden tones. 2 years ago, Henry said quietly, I forced a blind man to risk his life here out of pride and cruelty. Thomas could have died and I would be responsible, but he taught me that. Taught you what? Davidson asked, genuinely curious now. That true power doesn't come from the ability to destroy, but to build. That real wealth isn't in what we extract, but in what we preserve and multiply. At that moment, A blue butterfly landed on the railing near them. Davidson watched, fascinated, as its wings caught the light of the setting sun. "My mother collected butterflies," he said suddenly, surprising everyone. She said they were proof that beautiful change was possible. Thomas, who had remained silent, approached. "Would you like to touch the butterfly?" Davidson hesitated, then slowly extended his hand. To general astonishment, the butterfly flew directly to his palm, landing delicately. "How? The mountains—" "Creatures sense the intentions of the heart," Thomas explained. "It senses that you are ready for your own transformation." The tears that welled up in Davidson's eyes surprised everyone, including himself. "I haven't cried since my mother's funeral," he confessed. When the butterfly finally flew away, disappearing into the waterfall's mist, Davidson had made his decision. "I will maintain my investment," he announced. "More than that, I will increase it. And—" He paused, clearly struggling with the words. "I would like to learn about the plants, the traditions, about how to see with the heart, as you say." The celebration that night was different from any party the resort had ever hosted. There was no expensive champagne or sophisticated canapes. There was traditional music, homemade food, and a genuine joy that came from deep within the soul. Thomas gathered everyone in the center of the community hall, now beautifully restored. On the walls, photos told the story of the transformation, the before and after, not just of the buildings but of the people. "There is an ancient prophecy in our tribe," he began, his voice carrying throughout the hall. "It said that a day would come when the new and the old would dance together, when the heart of the mountain would beat in harmony with progress. Today, we see that prophecy being fulfilled." He raised a goblet of herbal tea, the same he had shared with Henry months ago. "To Rose, my beloved wife, wherever she is, this dream was yours. And to all of you who made it possible, may the mountain bless you as you have blessed it." Henry stood up, moved. "I came here as a conqueror, trying to tame what I didn't understand. Thomas showed me that some things shouldn't be tamed but honored. Sarah taught me that true strength is in kindness. This community gave me something all my money could never buy, a real purpose." He turned to Thomas. "I know I can never undo the harm I caused, but I hope my transformation serves as partial payment of that debt." "There is no debt where there is genuine forgiveness," Thomas replied. "And the mountain has already forgiven you. Proof of that is the nectar it granted you." The night went on with music, dancing, and stories. Children ran among the adults, elders shared memories, researchers chatted animatedly with traditional healers. It was a symphony of voices, cultures, and generations in perfect harmony. When the full moon rose over the mountain, Thomas invited everyone to go up to a special plateau. There, under the starry sky, he performed an ancient ceremony of gratitude. "May the waters remain pure," he chanted, and everyone repeated. "May the plants continue healing. May hearts continue opening. May wisdom continue flowing." At the final moment of the ceremony, something extraordinary happened. Thousands of fireflies emerged from the forest, creating a luminous cloud that enveloped the entire group. It was as if the mountain itself was celebrating. Sarah took her father's hand. Mom would be so proud. Thomas squeezed his daughter's hand, his moist eyes reflecting the light of the fireflies. "She is, my daughter. In every plant that blooms, every heart that heals, every life that transforms, Rose lives in all of this." Henry approached them, Davidson by his side. The four stood in silence, watching the spectacle of natural light, each processing their own journey. "You know," Davidson said finally, "I spent my whole life chasing success. Only now do I understand that success without meaning is failure in disguise. And meaning," Thomas completed gently, "comes from serving something greater than ourselves." 5 years later, the Rose Vance Center for Integrative Healing, a name chosen by unanimous community vote, had become a global reference. Delegations came from all continents to learn the model of sustainable development that respected traditions while embracing innovation. Sarah, now internationally recognized as a master in integrative medicine, led the research alongside a diverse team. Thomas, though officially retired, still guided the most important moments, his physical blindness compensated by an increasingly sharp spiritual vision. Henry divided his time between managing the complex and learning the healing arts. Surprisingly, he showed a natural talent for working with traumatized children, using techniques that combined modern psychology with traditional healing rituals. Davidson became the most unlikely of environmental advocates, using his influence and resources to protect sacred areas throughout the country. He often joked that he had traded his addiction to profits for an addiction to blue butterflies. On the 5th anniversary of the transformation, Thomas once again climbed the Waterfall's stones, this time not as a challenge, but as a celebration. Sarah guided his steps, while a crowd watched with reverence. Upon reaching the warrior's tier, Thomas raised his arms to the sky. "May this story inspire others," his voice echoed over the waters. "May it show that it's never too late for change, that forgiveness heals more than any herb, and that when we honor the wisdom of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future, we create miracles." A single blue butterfly emerged from the mist, circled 3 times over his head, then flew towards the rising sun. Sarah squeezed her father's arm. Henry smiled with tears in his eyes, and Davidson murmured a prayer of gratitude he had learned from Mrs. Gable. The waterfall continued its eternal song, witness to another story of transformation in the ancient mountains. And somewhere between heaven and earth, Rose's spirit smiled, knowing that her dream had not only come true,